Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Rational Female Podcast. And today I've got a lovely guest called Joomi Kim. So I came across her channel a short while ago, and she did a really interesting video on feminism, how feminism is ruining modern literature. And she mentioned some books that are basically pushing this kind of feminist bias. And as you guys know, if you're familiar with my work, I basically talk all about feminism, all about gender issues, and how modern society has been indoctrinated by the hostility between men and women that's been caused by misandry. So I really enjoyed Jimmy's video. And, I am also a author. I write books myself. And I think that, it's become very difficult to avoid feminism or any kind of ideology in literature. And we seem to be, seeing more and more of this. So Jimmy mentioned Sally Rooney in her video, who I'm actually a fan of. And, it's very, very hard. Like, you can enjoy someone's work, but not enjoy their political leaning. So, Jimmy, why don't you tell us what made you get into this whole field of interest and why you decided to make this video?
Yeah, so I've always loved literature, and I do a little writing on the side as well, some fiction writing, but I haven't published it. And so I read a lot of books. I'm always looking for contemporary works by women. I read a lot of older things too, but there's something about contemporary works, where it's easier to relate to. Sometimes you want to see works where there's a commentary on our society now. But I kept coming up against woke ideologies in books, and particularly when it came to female writers, there was often like a feminist theme, that was inserted there. Sometimes it would just be sprinkled in, and sometimes it would be like the essence of the whole book. And that was never a topic that really interested me. But it's beyond that. It's not just that like it didn't interest me. After a while, I started to get really annoyed with it. I was like, this is not that interesting. And you think that you see the world through this anti-male lens, which I thought was really warped. And I kept seeing it over and over again. So that was why I made that video.
Okay, so what for you constitutes a very pro-feminist leaning lens in fiction?
I think anything that shows women's viewpoint. When you say pro-feminist, do you mean the ideology or actually pro-women?
No, I mean the ideology. So the view I hold is that feminism is not pro-women because it frames women as victims. And this is a really interesting thought for me because I'm a writer and most of my books are about women. So I've published 15 romance novellas under a pen name. And I would not say my romance novellas are particularly ideologically framed. They're very much they're about university students who find love, and they do deal, like, a lot of the characters, some of them have mental illness, some have like OCD or ADHD, but I wouldn't necessarily say they're political. I would say they're more like social. I would say my general literary style is social commentary, but I wouldn't put it as pro-feminist, and my other novels, they're all about women. I could consider one of them maybe someone into, like, because there was one book of mine where one reviewer said it was pro-feminist, but then she started saying that it wasn't inclusive and it was pro a certain kind of elitism, and that made me very, very angry because she completely missed the point of the book. So she said it was feminist because there were a lot of prominent female characters, and the story, it's called Around Midnight, and the story is basically about a teenage girl who has an abusive boyfriend. But the point of the story is supposed to be about her individual journey. And I think if you're writing about individual women, I don't think that's the same as being pro-feminist, because feminism is very much a kind of women are a collective. Like, would you say, for example, that Disney films are primarily feminist?
Not necessarily. Well, I haven't watched the recent ones, but some of the older ones, not necessarily, just because it's shown from just because the main character is a woman, so I don't think something is feminist even if like all the characters are women, that doesn't necessarily make it feminist. yeah, somebody was saying that it's more like anti-male literature, like
Yeah.
this ideology that we have to be against men, and that, like you said, that we are a collective, which that's BS. But yeah, anti-male, I would say, and then also acting as if women are just superior just for being women and that they should be in charge of everything. To some extent, it's also this ideology that women should be like men. They should take over spaces, like be CEOs and things like that, like men. So I would say that that's kind of what makes it um, feminist.
Yeah, so basically pushing women in a kind of competition with men and
Yeah.
also women kind of trying to overthrow men. So it's interesting because one of my favorite authors is called Louise O'Neill, and she is a feminist. And I will say this as well, because obviously I didn't mention this to you, but I was a feminist the age 14 till 18, and I've slowly over the last 10 years become increasingly anti-feminist. But I say in my early 20s and maybe my mid 20s, no, my early to mid 20s, I was not a feminist, but I still hold beliefs which one might consider to be feminist leaning beliefs.
Hmm.
And I was genuinely kind of coming out of it. And I think also because I consider myself someone who holds culturally liberal views, liberal people are not necessarily like there are a lot of liberal people, and when I say liberal, I mean classically liberal, not leftist. There are people who have liberal views, but who are not necessarily pro woke or pro feminism. And I have met quite a few people like that. And I think there's people who would say, I would support gay marriage, for instance. I think abortion should be legalized. I support certain, with transgender people. I don't think they should be in sport, but I think if an adult wants to have a sex change, these are all liberal leaning views. And it seems that people who think like that don't really have a place
Hmm.
for this anywhere. So that's kind of annoying.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But
it seems
yeah.
like some of them have sort of gone to the right just because they have felt homeless.
Yeah, I would not consider myself right wing at all. So, yeah, somebody mentioned Terminator 2. That's really interesting. So, what would you say is the difference then between a book? Because there's a specific novel you talked about, which I actually thought sounded really interesting, called All Fools by Miranda July. And I
Mhm.
actually added this to my Goodreads list because I love to read it like you. I love reading. And what would you say is the difference then between a book which is, say, pro female or pro feminist? Because one of my favorite authors as well is actually a woman named Leanne Moriarty, and she writes women's fiction, but I wouldn't describe any of her books as particularly feminist. So, what do you think is the difference between a book about women, I gave the example earlier of Disney films, versus something that is actually explicitly feminist?
I think something could just be pro-female because it shows things from a woman's point of view. It could be a single character, it could be multiple characters, and you get to be in the shoes of that person. And I think this is a good thing that we have this, because when you look back centuries, there just wasn't a lot written by women. So we don't really know how women thought. We know very little the further back you go. So I think it's great that now it's common for women to write. So I think anything where you're getting the point of view from women that is pro female, and it doesn't have to be uh, like stories that are only unique to women, although they can be. But whereas feminist is more like where you can tell the author buys into a certain kind of ideology, like this victimhood, or anti maleness, things like that. So that's how I differentiate between them.
I would say the same thing. Yeah, that's great. I'm trying to think now what a good response to that is 'cause some very interesting stuff there. I enjoy a lot of different authors. My favorite author is probably Stephen King. So my favorite author as a child was called Jacqueline Wilson, and she wrote about social issues concerning children. She wrote a lot about things like domestic violence and mental health. And I definitely wouldn't describe her books as feminist at all. The characters were largely female, and there was a focus on the female experience, as you said. But no, I wouldn't say they were pro feminist. And I think what is the line that we're walking? One of my favorite movies is called Legally Blonde. And the way I see it, I don't see that as a particularly feminist film. And one of the obvious reasons for me is because it ends with the main character ending up married or in a relationship. And there's no element of her from like saying, oh, I hate men, men are trash. I suppose you could say there's some, because you do have the framing of have you seen Legally Blonde, by the way?
Yeah, I did. Actually,
Check.
something that I was thinking about that movie, because I remember it was Reese Witherspoon, right?
Yeah, yeah.
I remember like she really liked to be in pink, and she would have like these.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, she's really girly. I love
Yeah, and I
it.
can imagine that like nowadays people would be annoyed with that movie and call it like retrograde or something, just because they're like, oh, it's like you're stereotyping women because saying that they all like pink or something like that, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that movie, then I think we can agree that is not a feminist film. It's a pro-female film. So it's about a woman's journey. She goes to Harvard, and it's more of a personal journey. And so there's this YouTube channel I used to watch for years called The Take, and they would basically critique films and analyze movies, not critique, but more analyze movies, and I love movies from a feminist perspective, but they never said we're feminists, but it started to show up over time. And the video they made talking about Legally Blonde, they made a point about how this is focusing on her story as an individual, but it's not elevating all women. So I think that's the feminist kind of argument, that they're not, if something isn't elevating women as a collective group against the male patriarchy, then it's not necessarily feminist.
Yeah.
So that is what I would say. I think if you're talking about, a woman's personal experience, like let's say she went through a book about a woman going through a divorce, a book about a woman being cheated on, a book about a woman suffering from mental illness, this doesn't have to have any sort of, I'm somehow speaking for all women. It's about me as an individual. And I think that is because classical liberalism is about individual freedom. It's about, I'm a person, I'm an individual. Whereas feminism, it gears its ideas more from Marxist framing, which is about we are a collective and we want to overthrow the patriarchy. So I think that is kind of a distinction I would make. Anything which is about women as a collective have to come together versus I am an individual, this is my journey.
Mm-hmm.
That makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Yeah. I think that there are sometimes works that are a little bit borderline. Like I've come across some fiction where there isn't some obvious feminist ideology coming through, but like every single male character is a horrible person and the women are victims. And then that's where it gets to be a little bit fuzzy. You're like, oh, this seems a bit feminist actually. But yeah.
So The Surface Breaks by Louise O'Neill, it actually is exactly that. And this is where, again, I'd make the distinction between pro-female, pro-feminist. So The Little Mermaid, actually, that's a really good example. The Little Mermaid, both the Hans Christian Andersen tale and the Disney tale, they're not really feminist. The Hans Christian Andersen tale is about, well, actually, it's basically about Christianity. It's about this idea of self-sacrifice and virtue, whereas the Disney tale is a romantic story. But Louise O'Neill's book, The Surface Breaks, I'm just looking as I have it on my bookshelf. It's basically, so it's the same style of the Hans Christian Andersen tale. There's a mermaid who wants to go and live on land. She falls in love with this man and she gives up her voice to be with him. But the ending, you can see this is very explicitly feminist. And also, I think there is one likable male character out of about 10. The men are just terrible. All the women are empowered victims. There's no sense of women being badly. And this is also what I can't stand. It's just like no actual indication whatsoever of women behaving badly, of female wrongdoing. It's just this absolving of female responsibility that I don't like. So somebody mentioned Sex and the City, which is one of my favorite shows because it's very, very funny. But Sex and the City, Carrie Bradshaw, she's terrible. She behaves awfully. And there's nobody tells her off, really, apart from maybe Charlotte at one point. But we're just supposed to go along with what she's doing, and she's the victim. So it's this, I'm a victim. I'm not going to hold myself accountable. And yeah, I can't stand that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I sort of feel similarly. Like I like that show because it was fun, but there are annoying ideologies behind it, which I didn't see at the time, actually. But now looking back, I can kind of see it. And also Samantha, the character Samantha, was a very unrealistic kind of woman. Like she was basically like a man in a woman's body, that character.
Absolutely. I mean, I think Samantha's hilarious, but it's true, she's not a realistic woman. And most women don't really enjoy that kind of lifestyle. Most women who do that don't enjoy it, or they wouldn't talk like it's not empowering for women to go out and have multiple sexual partners. I'm of the view that I don't think anyone should behave like that, really, because I think that it doesn't do you much good long term. And that's also coming from, looking at the effects on mental health and that, and also addiction as well. But yeah, Samantha, like it's just strange how they highlight, because also I think, I'm not sure if it was you or somebody else. I saw someone say this online, but the show Sex and the City, it was actually written like they're gay men, and I think it was actually created by gay men. So it's basically gay men, and because gay men, obviously, it's a whole different world to the world of women. And, homosexual men, they'll have lots of sexual partners, but women don't really want to behave like that. Most women, for example, over 80% of romance readers are women. Most women want to see a story about, a happy ending, and that usually means the woman and the man fall in love and get married and happily ever after. That's what most women generally enjoy seeing. They don't enjoy seeing a story about a woman with, oh, I have a different guy every week. It's not really very, it comes across as a bit, I don't even know what the right word is, but I don't know. I think most women don't enjoy that kind of lifestyle, really. Not long term, anyway.
Yeah, agree.
Yeah. So, do you have any particularly favorite female authors that you have read?
I do. A lot of them happen to be from sort of the early 20th century or before. I really like Jane Austen and Angela Carter. She actually writes some things that you could say are coming from a feminist angle, but the difference is that she was writing at a time where it sort of made more sense. And I just like her writing too. And Willa Cather is another one. Yeah, there are many. But yeah, it's interesting that a lot of them happen to be from the early 20th century or before that. Like there aren't as many recent ones. It doesn't mean that I don't find books that I enjoy from women. It's just they just happen to not be my favorites.
Okay. So, I don't know two of them, but I know Jane Austen. And actually, Janice Fiamengo, my hero, did a really good video on Jane Austen and how, Jane Austen wouldn't have necessarily labeled herself as pro-feminist or not, but she was commenting on female temperament, and her general view is that women should rein it in. They should learn how to temper their emotions and be rational and go essentially lead with reason, because as we know, women tend to be much more emotionally, women are more, it's not that women are more emotional, man, that's not the right framing, but women are not as rational as men in the same way. Like men are much more logical. That's why men are usually better suited to doing things like fixing things or whatever. Whereas women, we tend to be more emotive. Like when we get together with our female friends, we just talk, and that's just a feminine thing to do. And I think that Janice's framing was that Jane Austen was basically saying that women should learn to actually not overindulge in emotion. I think that was very interesting because, I think that women were the more kind of we're more we use psychology against other women. We use things like tearing women down. I'm not saying me as in whatever. I'm saying like women as a collective. Women tear other women down. Women use a lot of psychology, and women also. I think what feminism has done, it's allowed women to indulge in toxic feminine behaviors like personal grievance and victimhood. Like, for example, if a guy treats you badly, and I'm not saying if a guy is actually abusive towards you, that's different. I'm saying if a guy, say, for example, you go out with a guy and then he just ghosts you, rather than seeing that as, okay, I can be upset, but I can move on. That doesn't mean I need to say all men are bad. What's happening now is this feminist indulgence of saying, oh, girl, men are trash. And it's all over social media now. And I don't like it because I don't think that's very helpful. I don't think it's helpful for women to have this mentality that because one person wasn't very good to me, suddenly all men are bad. If that makes sense.
something about Jane Austen is that she kind of satirized everyone, including certain types of women, and especially frivolous women, So yeah, she was like an equal opportunity satirist, in my opinion. Um, Actually, there's one more thing I want to say related to this, is that sometimes I find that some of the most effective, more feminist literature, right? Not feminist meaning buying into a certain ideology, but literature that will make you feel more sympathetic towards women's problems, right? Unique problems, are works like Anna Karenina. Have you read that?
Mm, I haven't read it, but I want to. Yeah, I haven't actually read Jane Austen, um, or Anna Karenina, which is Tolstoy. But yeah, no, yeah, I can see where you're going with that. Please continue.
Yeah, I mean, this is not a major spoiler because most people know that, like, Anna Karenina in that book, she has an affair, right? And
Yeah.
then she's with her lover, but the way society treats her is very different than the male lover. Like, he can go around in society whereas she can't, and she's kind of banished. She can't even really go to the opera without there being kind of like a mini scandal, and it's very unfair to women. And it's not as if Tolstoy was writing it from like, I'm a feminist or anything like that. It was just, that was just the way it was told, from like almost like a, I mean, it's certainly sympathetic towards her, but it's not like there's this ideology coming through that's very obvious. And I feel like that's almost more like pro-feminist in a way than some of the things that I sometimes see nowadays. At least it makes you more sympathetic, right, towards women back then.
Yeah, so to me, that just sounds like good writing. And I also think that with things like that, because there's always a reason for why things were the way they were. So, for example, women in the past were condemned more in, let's say, like more recent, last few 100 years, in the kind of Christian era, because they were condemned more for like having affairs or flaunting sexuality. I'm not saying I agree with that at all, but the reason why was because it was usually other women who would look down on women who were too overtly sexual, and this evolutionary concept of female intersexual competition. Women
Mm-hmm.
tend to judge women who are very overtly sexual or promiscuous harsher than they judge women who are, say, more modest or don't have as many partners.
Mm-hmm.
So something that feminists often conveniently leave out is how women have actually contributed to the kind of the treatment of other women, and they frame everything as, oh, it's men's
Mm-hmm.
fault. But actually, men, I would say, tend to be a bit softer towards women than
Yeah, yeah,
women tend to be towards each other. I think men on the whole are actually gentler and softer to women, and I think women are a bit more kind of catty. I think women, we tend to be much sharper with each other because we have this competition, whether we wanted to or not. It's like that's the way it is. So yeah, I think that Tolstoy, again, I haven't read Anna Karenina, but I'm aware that because there are the argument that women in the main feminist argument is women in the past were oppressed, and I think it's a very simplistic and reductionist worldview. I think women had a lot of problems. I think men had just as many problems, and I think that if you look at the scope of humanity and look at various cultures and societies, you start to see that actually people had problems, but it wasn't like men were oppressing women. It was more like women had duties and men had duties because most of human civilization was geared towards survival, really. And, men, they weren't always having a great time either. So I don't think it's quite so clear cut to say that women were somehow subjugated. That's my perspective anyway. But I don't think it's fair to say women were oppressed. And I actually think it's very disempowering. Like, for example, some of the most powerful people in the world, like Cleopatra or Hypatia, Nefertiti, Boudica, Joan of Arc, these people were women. So I don't really believe that women were ever oppressed in the way that feminists have said. I believe more that women have had difficulties and that those difficulties sometimes came from other women, so
yeah.
mothers or grandmothers. And that's just a side of the story we never hear about, really.
No, that's a good point. And the men had to go fight off in bloody battles and were killed violently, much more than the women. And the other thing is just that we don't talk about like all the soft power that women had, sometimes behind
Absolutely.
the scenes often, but through manipulation or love, right? You know, if you were the wife of a powerful person, you had a certain kind of soft power. And unfortunately, that wasn't written about as much, but it existed.
Absolutely. I mean, just thinking, because I've got this bookshelf here. I'm trying to think if there are any relevant books. I mean, Agatha Christie, she was an author in the 1900s. I always get the centuries mixed up. But you know, she wrote about women, she wrote about men, and she wrote about, I think the main thing is she wrote about people. And she was a widely successful author. I think she's one of the most successful English authors. I
Hmm.
read and then there were none. Very, very good book. You know, I think that it's basically, yeah, and as you said, you know, feminine soft power, that is very, very overlooked by feminists because, for example, you know, what kind of power does a wife hold? A husband has to defer to his wife in a marriage. You know, he has to get her opinion on things. He has to make decisions that are going to benefit the family. A wife will often tell her husband, no, don't do that. You can't do that, in a very subtle way. So there's no acknowledgement of feminine power from feminists. There's no acknowledgement of the feminine experience. And I actually think, and perhaps you agree, that one of the biggest problems of feminism is that it's trying to make women be like men
Hmm.
and, you know, compete with men and act like a man. And, you know, we can't. We're not the same as men. We're very, very different. Our biology is different. Our psychology is different. It's ridiculous to say that women should be like men.
No, I 100% agree. That was one of the things that I was noticing in a lot of the women's literature. Not just women who were having sex like men, enjoying casual sex, which I thought a lot of those characters felt unrealistic to me. But also like this idea of like we got to be the girl boss, you know, and that's what's the most fulfilling. And if you don't do that, you're a loser. If you just want to be a housewife or the mother who stays at home, you're you're not successful as a woman, you know. So I think that's been incredibly damaging to modern women.
Absolutely, because statistically, most women actually want to be wives and mothers. Oh, you know what? It just pops into my head. You should read this book called "I Don't Know How She Does It" by Alison Pearson. It's one of my favorite novels. I know you mentioned you like a lot of older literature, but contemporary. So because I've read quite a bit of contemporary women's fiction, and this book, I don't know how she does it. It's about a very successful woman who works in finance, and it basically shows how she's juggling having a career with having a husband and children. And it's like she's just stressed all the time. It's very, very humorous. It's kind of a, I guess you could say, a comedy. And yeah, it's brilliant because it actually is very realistic. And Alison Pearson, she's a British columnist. I think she would describe herself as a maybe a libertarian feminist, if you could, yeah, I suppose like Christina Hoff Sommers type. But what she does in this book, because I read this book and I was blown away. I was like, wow, this is actually very, very anti-feminist to me anyway. I
Hmm.
wrote it a few years ago. And, you know, it's very much showing how actually modern feminism has put so much pressure on women to be like men and doesn't allow for the woman who wants to be a housewife, doesn't allow for the woman who wants to be a stay at home mother. It sees these women as somehow being oppressed. And it doesn't acknowledge that, you know, women now are doing two jobs. They're working in the home and they're working outside the home. And most women, especially women who have children, don't want to be doing two jobs because it's very, very stressful.
Yeah. Anyway, that book sounds interesting. I'll check it out.
Yeah, I'll send you a reading list. Yeah, but there's other books. Like, for example, one of my other favorite books is called Eleanor Oliphant is Completely Fine. And it's about this woman called Eleanor, who she's a very, very interesting character. And it shows how she went through this very serious trauma, which isn't revealed till the end. And she becomes obsessed with this musician and she kind of goes through life. She's an outcast and she's got her own personal problems. I think it's kind of considered that she might be autistic, but it's a very interesting novel. I would not call it feminist at all. It's just about a woman. And I like to think that my own fiction is the same. Like I've got one book called Every Last Psycho, which contains two novellas, and they're both about women who have both different psychological ailments. So one of the well, not women, they're teenagers, but one of them she's a schizophrenic and the other one is a psychopath. And so it's kind of a psychology type book. And then
Mhm.
I've got this other book called Anne, which is about a girl who grows up in a household where there's a lot of domestic violence. And Anne actually is a lesbian. But that was not because I'm trying to be pro LGBT. It was more because I thought it was just how the character came to me. And her being gay is not a huge part of the story. It's more about her relationship with her family and her personal experience. So it goes back to the idea of like a personal journey.
Mhm.
Um, I would actually say, if I remember correctly, her family, or definitely her father, because her father's actually a terrible person, but her background is definitely more conservative, I would say, anyway, politically. But UK conservatives are not the same as American conservatives. And then I've got this other book called Around Midnight, which I mentioned earlier, which is about a girl who has an abusive boyfriend. But I would say that's probably the only one which one might label as feminist. But for me, again, also because I was a bit younger, I was in my early 20s when I published most of these books. And my view now might be slightly different to my view then, but I'm not sure if I would describe them as feminist or just about female personal journeys. And I think female, like any journey, any story about personal journey, especially about mental health, for me, that's something I care a lot about. I don't think that that's necessarily feminist. Like I remember even Around Midnight, her dad is a very good guy. Um, yeah, I don't know, but it's a challenge, isn't it? Because like I've got this other novel I'm working on at the moment, and I want to get it because my other books are all self-published, and I want to get this novel traditionally published, but I don't uh yeah, I don't want to use my name, for example, because I'm worried that publishers might look at my work on YouTube. They might see me and say, okay, she's, got these views. So that's another whole big problem that publishing now is so driven by ideology. And if you don't support this feminism or wokeism or, queerism, then you're not really part of the club, so to speak.
No, it's a real problem. Just such a high percentage of them are just like overtly woke. I don't know if you saw one of my other videos where I just in the beginning of the video I went into a bookstore and just there was like a table in the very front which just had a mix of recent fiction and like some very high percentage of them were obviously like woke, just from reading the description of the book. It was just absolutely ridiculous. And there are people, I guess, who want this for sure, so it's not just coming from nowhere. There are people who want that, but I got to think that there's like, I don't know, at least half the population who like don't want that. I don't know. I don't know if we're going to eventually have publishing houses that are a little more open-minded. I mean, there's a few here and there, but they are minorities at this point.
Yeah, it's very sad. Wokeism has become so pervasive, and I think that what saddens me as well is why can't we tell a story about a gay person without needing to make a big deal about them being gay? Why can't we tell a story about a person of color without, oh, this is a black experience? It's just ridiculous, and I can't stand it. And I actually try to avoid that in my books because I would say a lot of my books are very diverse, but it's not the point of the story. I'm not trying to make a point about them. Oh, I'm gay, I'm diverse. It's more like it's embedded within the story. That's what I would say. And yeah, I'm really with you on walking into a bookshop and you see these books and there's all these like trans this and queer power that, and it's just so cringe. It's like, I think that the majority of people don't want that. Like, I think more people actually don't support that. And I think most people actually hold the view that I'm not against people being gay or being, transsexual or being female or anything. It's this idea of it's just being in your face all the time. And I actually think that that fuels the other side, which is the hostile, very, I don't like gay people. I don't like black people. Like, I think that's this wokeism is kind of fueling the kind of more, you could say, hard right
Yeah.
views where there are people who would say, oh, I don't think any women should be able to vote. I don't think women should be able to drive, because that is the other side, and that's a very extreme view. And I think, the worry is that we've become so ideologically split now culturally in the West between these two polarities. And I think it's ridiculous. And I think, art It's supposed to be about freedom of expression. So literature is supposed to be a space where people can express themselves. Like my favorite author is Stephen King, and he never has any kind of, ideology. He doesn't really say like I'm rereading it right now, and there's I don't think it would get published today because he
Oh,
uses
really?
certain sorry.
Oh, that's surprising. I didn't know that. I haven't read anything by him.
Oh, okay. But like, yeah, it's by Stephen King. So the book, I don't think it will get published today because there's things in that book which wouldn't be allowed. And he, for me, comes across as just I'm just telling a story. It's just an interesting story. So yeah.
That's interesting to hear that you're seeing something similar in London, but I guess it's not surprising.
Oh
Like
god,
I
no,
guess
London's very,
major
very
cities are all a bit alike that way, a bit homogenized, in terms of the kind of literature that they see.
yeah. Well, whereabouts do you live in America, sorry?
New York.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, New York, I imagine New York and London are quite similar, both very cosmopolitan and have these kind of ideologies that are, very mainstream.
Are
But
you
yeah,
familiar?
so do you actually
Oh,
go on?
sorry. I was gonna ask, are you familiar with Andrew Tate?
Oh god,
He's
yeah,
one
I
of
don't
these.
really want to talk about him. Okay.
Yeah, no, because he's one of these people, who he seems to be very popular, but I believe he thinks that women shouldn't even vote, right? Or he's kind of this other
Yeah.
extreme.
I don't like talking about him if that's okay. He's not someone I talk about. But yeah, I'm very, very familiar with him. I mean, I think that yeah. I'm just gonna ask something. So, do you think then that a lot of like modern women who are, say, in the public eye or who are in the creative arts, who are maybe actors or writers, do you think, or even women in other industries like I don't know, corporate world, whatever, is there pressure on women to say I'm a feminist? Would you say?
There probably is, but I would say that a lot of the women actually buy into it as well, and a lot of the pressure is there's probably pressure coming from institutions, but also other women. You know, yeah. My answer is yes. I think there's pressure, but I think quite a lot of them do what they do not because they're feeling pressure, but because they actually believe in it.
Okay. So that's interesting because that kind of ties in with what I was saying earlier about women, being the ones who can gang up on other women and shame other women. So would you say then it's like women are kind of pushing for women who maybe wouldn't say they're a feminist to be a feminist?
I don't know. I mean, I've heard that like in publishing, and publishing, for example, is very female dominated, like the editors and all these people. So I've heard that, but I'm not super familiar with that world. Um, what I can say is that I'm sure if you wrote something that was sort of anti-feminist, like I think you would have a harder time getting published. So that I feel confident in saying. Yeah, I don't know. When it comes to universities, so I came from a science background, and there wasn't really any of this kind of thing back then. But I have heard that in the humanities, right, there is pressure like that. They all buy into certain ideologies, and you can't even get hired if you don't buy into those ideologies. If you're a right wing, that you'd be labeled right wing, just for pushing back on that.
It's terrible, yeah. And I think, Jordan Peterson has talked about this quite a lot. It's very, very bad. And I think that, you know, I'm trying to think very seriously about where this came from. Because I would say, like, my generation, I'm Gen Z, I'm 28. I've kind of come of age in the rise of this getting more and more ubiquitous. And, it concerns me that this is kind of the way it is now. Because I think what is going to be the effect on women, on men, on societies, marriage, and also things like creativity. Like how are we going to have books that are diverse in the sense that they capture a diversity of experiences, not just necessarily like racially or sexually diverse, but diverse in that we see a range of experiences. Like I would love to see a book, for example, about a man dealing with hostility from women. Have you read Gone Girl?
No, I've seen the movie.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
Gone Girl is a very, very interesting example because even though the author, I would say, would identify as a feminist, the book itself leans towards being more, I would say, anti-feminist because it's kind of subverting the trope of man bad, woman good. And
Hmm.
instead it shows that actually the woman is the villain. And it's very
Hmm.
well done.
Hmm. I guess that was unintentional, maybe on her part.
Yeah, maybe. But that's the thing. Sometimes people just want to tell a good story. And I think that, sometimes people aren't thinking about like ideology. Sometimes like that's what I love about Stephen King. He just wants to tell a story. Like the book I'm working on, it's just a teen horror novel. It's not really got any ideology behind it. And I think, people read. I mean, why do people read? We read for entertainment, for escapism, maybe to have a different perspective on the world. I don't think people, if you're reading a fiction book, you don't really want a lecture.
No, no. Most people just want a good story. Yeah. A lecture is one of the most annoying things, although sometimes maybe you might appreciate it if you agree with the ideology, but if you disagree, it's going to be really annoying. And also, if it comes across too lectury, I feel like the writer has failed.
Yeah, because then it's kind of like a polemic. It's like it's not really a story. So,
Yeah,
what
it
would
should.
you say is one of the? Sorry.
No, I was saying it should be a story first.
Yeah. What would you say is one of the worst kind of pro feminist fictional books that you have read?
Probably some of the ones that I mentioned in my video. That one that I mentioned called
All
Scaffolding,
four. Oh
which
yeah.
takes place in Paris. What was really remarkable about that one was that that there were these women who were cheating on their partners, and they were kind of painting it as like almost like a feminist act, to cheat on their perfectly fine partners. The partners were not bad people or abusing their, the women or anything like that. Maybe the worst thing was that they were like a bit clueless about what was going on. But the women in that book, like they would cheat, and they would literally say things like, "This was like my right as a woman," or something like that. To indulge in these pleasures or something like that. That was probably the worst, because it was just like telling women to basically just be horrible. Like, it's okay for you to be a horrible person so long as like the person you're hurting is a man, but they're not bad people that you're hurting. And then at the same time telling people that like promiscuity is somehow feminist. And I that's another thing that was in the book, where this idea that cheating or being promiscuous was like some birthright as a woman. That was also in that book, All Fours. There was a similar thing there. And I think I also came across some statements like where monogamy was like patriarchal, that they had that kind of idea espoused in there. So yeah, I think that the books that I discussed in that video were probably the worst. That's why I featured those books. And by the way, that book, All Four, is like, it's kind of entertaining, actually. It's just that like I found it really annoying because of the main character and all these like feminists and woke ideologies in there. Yeah, same with Sally Rooney.
Yeah, no, well, feminism, certainly post second wave feminism, has been very, very anti marriage because I think what feminism fundamentally does is it creates a rift between the sexes
Hmm.
So it doesn't surprise me that they would frame cheating as empowering. And it's really, really stupid because when you think of how women get so hostile and angry if their partner cheats on them, yet they'll be okay with women cheating. Suddenly, women cheating is empowerment, which is ridiculous. I don't think anyone should cheat. I think cheating is, you're breaking you like if you've made a commitment to somebody and then you break that commitment, then well, that's not good. I actually remember you said something I really liked in the video when I saw, which was that marriage is making a promise to someone. I think that's a very nice way of putting it. So if two people get married, they're making a promise. It doesn't have to be some kind of political act. It also isn't something that should be, because a lot of feminists would say, that marriage is a patriarchal institution. Marriage is a very, very old institution. And historically, it was about economic stability and land ownership, property rights, and lineage. So it had these very old traditional standards. And what annoys me as well sometimes is if I want to read a book that's basically say about the history of marriage or something like this, there's always this like, oh, we got to look at how women were somehow being subjugated. There's never any like neutral outlook on marriage. That's why it's very hard also to find this information because marriage wasn't about oppressing women. It was about men and women upholding certain duties and responsibilities for the betterment of their society, for the betterment of their family. And it was about keeping society stable because humans evolved out of the hunter gatherer stage into the agrarian stage where there was domesticity of plants. And that's where you had this hierarchical society. And it was all about stability. It wasn't about oppression. This isn't to say that women never suffered. Of course, they did and always have. But it's also not fair to say that women were exclusively suffering because of their gender. I don't buy into that viewpoint. I completely reject that premise. I think that men suffered as much as women. Men had to go out to fight in war, as was said earlier. Men had to work in the fields. And effectively, men and women had to work together to keep society stable. So it's a very strange premise. And I think that feminism has just framed everything. All of human history is framed as a story of male suffering and female oppression, which I think is a very, very dangerous framing because it's like, if you're going to look at the whole world like that, you're lacking empathy for 50% of the population. And you're also giving the other 50% an excuse to say cheating is empowering or being a bad person is empowering.
Yeah. That's a very destructive ideology. And I understand why people see marriage through a political lens. And I mean, the government is involved and you can argue about like whether that's good or not, but it doesn't have to be, and I just find it really remarkable that like through all of this discourse, it somehow gets lost that like people made promises when they got married to their partners, and they somehow justify breaking promises, right? Which is a personal thing, like a moral and personal thing. They somehow justify that just because patriarchy, So that is kind of crazy to me. I don't know the full history of marriage, but my guess is, as you were saying, that it's complicated, and both men and women sometimes they might have felt like it was restrictive to some degree. People had less say over who they married than they do today, and there were certainly stories where people didn't want to get married to the person they were getting married to. But at the same time, some of it was also meant to protect, not just lineage and property, but also like women just getting knocked up with the guy leaving, right? Like that was never a good thing for women either, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
And, maybe the solution isn't always like for her to marry the guy that knocks her up. That's not always the good solution either. But, it was meant to protect families and the individuals sometimes, not always perfectly, but it was there for a reason. But not only that, I think that it's also based on biology, not marriage, but I just mean this impulse for monogamy. It's we have this physiological thing that happens where we're falling in love and then we want exclusivity with a person, and maybe it's not forever, but it's certainly long enough for raising babies, right? Which take a long time to reach maturity. And I think that that's also something people forget. Like biologically, like, we're meant to pair up, maybe not for life, I'm not sure, but at least for long periods of time, like certain other species, some birds as well, right? So that's the other thing, is that, like, we're sort of meant to do that. And just because we're meant to biologically do that, and we have these physiological mechanisms, doesn't mean that that's how we should always act. But if you are rejecting that, you are rejecting certain things about your own biology. You're going against your own biology to a certain extent, by saying that we should just, like, forget about all these impulses of wanting exclusivity or monogamy or commitment, so yeah.
Yeah, I definitely agree. There's a biological drive in people to reproduce. That's obviously why people, these systems like marriage were created, because people have certain needs. So there's a very practical reason. And you're absolutely correct. Women are the ones who get pregnant. That's one of the reasons why sex was kept within marriage. It wasn't necessarily about female oppression. It was more about women are the ones who can get pregnant. And we don't have, back then there was no contraception, there was no pill or IUD or anything. So there are consequences. And I think that people aren't taking that into account at all when they talk about the past. People are not looking at the genuine reasons for why things were the way they were. People weren't looking. Oh, my chair is squeaking. Oops. Oops. Yeah, this fell off anyway. People weren't looking at the things that were keeping society together. People weren't looking at things like, for example, men had to pay a dowry. Men had to pay for, if they wanted to marry somebody. And also, one of the reasons why, like, if a woman got pregnant, the man married her, it was seen as a mark of honor. So it was like, I'm honoring the woman. This is what ideas like chivalry are very important. So it's really, really false, I think, to paint human history with this feminist paintbrush and say, like, women were being oppressed. It's so nuanced, and it's not so clear cut. It's not as clear as to say, oh, women were all being oppressed.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess we could round off by basically saying, did you actually enjoy reading Sally Rooney, by the way?
I could see why people like her. There were moments, in one of the two books more than the others. I forget which one, but I could see why people like her. If you like romance stories, and I like romance sometimes. I think that I was just annoyed over and over again too much, though. That yeah, I don't know if enjoy is the right word. It had its moments, let's say. The book All Fours, there were moments where I enjoyed that more, even though I also got annoyed with it. But Sally Rooney, it was hard to enjoy.
Yeah. I've read Normal People and Conversations with Friends. I really liked both of them. I really enjoyed Conversations with Friends because, I don't know, for me it was just very interesting, but I like drama in fiction. I like a lot of drama. I was annoyed that there were no speech marks. That got on my nerves. I don't know why she did that. It's a very strange stylistic choice. I kind of got used to it after a while, but that got on my nerves. I don't know why she doesn't use speech marks.
I can see why she appeals to a certain type of person. Like, you want to see characters that you can relate to, and there are things I can relate to in some of her characters, even though they're very different from me and very, like, they're like Marxist and whatever. I'm definitely not.
Yeah.
But certain like millennials, who are creatives, right, living in urban areas, like, theoretically, I really like books like that, because I can relate to people like that, even though politically we may not be aligned. But I want to see that, and then with a love story as well in there, great, all like formula for really entertaining read, but it's just more that, like, there were too many annoying ideological things in there that prevented me from really truly enjoying it. Plus, I didn't love the writing. I don't actually think she's a good writer, but that's a separate point.
Okay. I actually liked her writing, but that's fair enough. Yeah, no, well, urban woke millennials, I mean, that's welcome to my world, My generation, everybody's like that. Most people, it's even getting worse now with people in their early 20s. Yeah, everyone is like that. A lot of people there, when I was at university, it's really hard to find people who don't think like that, I think. I find generally that more men are geared away from that line of thinking and more women are geared towards it. There's
Yeah.
even been studies saying now about how men are becoming more right and women are becoming more left, even though it's not necessarily the right terms to use. But yeah, it's exhausting, it's annoying. I just want to see more fiction that tackles various subjects that affects both sexes without necessarily having a political framing, unless the book is explicitly political.
Hmm.
Because there are some really, really good old books out there. Loads that not like I like, for example, Sylvia Plath the Bell Jar. That's actually one of my favorite novels. And I think that, that talks about mental health, but I wouldn't call Sylvia Plath a feminist. I would say that she was just a woman who obviously went through a lot of personal struggles, but to say she was a feminist, I think it's just incorrect. Like, I don't think we should just start saying any woman who ever did anything of any worth or noteworthy in society and human history was a feminist. You know what I mean?
Yeah. No, and I just want, for the most part, fiction that isn't overtly ideological or political, and that's what I would want. I mean, sometimes it's fun to read something political, and it would be great to see more books that are more like representative of my sort of views. But really, what I would like to see is like a little bit more ideological neutrality when I like go to the bookstore and I see all the books that they're promoting, right? Just like a little bit more balance. That's really all I want.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Jimmy. It's been a pleasure to have you on the channel. Yeah, for everyone who's interested, I have a Substack now as well. Just gonna plug it in the chat. I'm writing regular essays where I critique feminism, and I myself am a self-published author of many, many books in young adult fiction and in the romance genre. But yeah, thank you very much for listening. And next, we'll be having Saving Culture from Itself on the show. So yeah, thank you, everyone. And this is The Rational Female tuning out.
Bye.